The first thing Clara Pruitt did every morning was listen. Not for birdsong, not for the wind coming down off the mountain. She listened for footsteps, counted them, measured the weight and the speed and the particular drag of a boot heel that told her everything she needed to know about what kind of morning it was going to be. 6 steps from the bed to the door of the cabin. A pause. Then either the door opened outward toward the outhouse, or it did not. If it did not open, if those 6 steps stopped and turned back toward the bed, she had maybe 4 minutes before Vernon was fully awake and looking for something to be wrong. This morning, the door had opened. She had counted to 30 after the sound of his boots on the frozen ground faded. Then she got up dressed in the dark and walked the 112 steps from the cabin to the ranch kitchen without a lantern because she had walked it enough times to know exactly where the ice collected near the water barrel and exactly where the second porch step groaned loud enough to wake a light sleeper. She was not careless. She had learned not to be. The kitchen at Granger Ranch was the largest room Clara had been responsible for in her 24 years of living, and she had loved it exactly once on the first morning she stood in it alone and understood that for the next several hours no one would come in unless she allowed it. That had been 8 months ago. The love had not entirely gone. It had just gotten complicated the way most things did when Vernon was involved. She lit the stove with 3 matches because her right hand was not cooperating this morning. She switched to her left without thinking about it. She had been doing a great many things with her left hand lately. The cast iron skillet went on first, then the coffee pot. Then she began working the biscuit dough she had started the night before left to rise under a cloth near the warmth of the banked coals. The dough pushed back against her palms, and she pushed back harder, and somewhere in that rhythm her breathing evened out, and the tight band across her ribs loosened just enough to let her take a full breath without the small catching sound she had learned to suppress. 3 ribs. She was fairly certain it was 3. She had broken one before at 13, falling from the fence post she had been told not to climb, and she remembered the feeling. This was that feeling multiplied. She had bound herself tightly with strips of cotton cut from an old petticoat, and she did not think about it any more than she thought about the weather. It was a condition. Conditions were managed. She was reaching for the lard tin when she caught her reflection in the dark window above the sink. She looked away immediately. Not from shame exactly, though shame had lived in her so long it had become like furniture present and unremarkable. She looked away because Vernon had told her more than once that a woman of her size had no business admiring herself. He had not said it cruelly the first time. He had said it the way you might point out that a chair was wobbling as a practical observation as a service. She was not built for vanity, she was built for work. He had married her anyway, which he occasionally reminded her was a kind of generosity. She had believed him. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone on the bad mornings, not what he said, that she had believed him. The biscuit dough went into the pan. She began cracking eggs, 12 of them, moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned that sudden movements drew attention, and attention from the wrong direction was always costly. She did not hear him come in. That was the first thing she noticed about Holt Granger in those early months, before she had cataloged all his other qualities the way she cataloged everything quietly and without sentimentality. He did not announce himself. A man his size, she would have expected the opposite. He was taller than the kitchen doorframe by 1.5 inches, and she knew this precisely because she had measured the doorframe with her eyes on her second day of work, calculating escape routes the way she calculated everything. He had to turn slightly sideways to bring his shoulders through. He weighed more than 2 of her, she estimated, and her estimation was not flattering to herself. His hands, when she had first seen them wrapped around a fence post he was resetting in frozen ground, had looked less like hands than like tools, heavy and specific, and made for one purpose. And yet he moved through a room the way snow moved. You did not hear it falling. You simply looked up and it was there. He came through the kitchen door at 4:15, and Clara did not flinch because she had not heard him coming. She felt him before she heard him, felt the shift in the air, the particular density of a large man entering a small space, and her body did what her body had learned to do in the past 18 months. It went still. It waited. Then she heard the sound of the coffee pot being lifted. Not her coffee pot, but the old tin one she kept on the back of the stove for whenever he came through in the mornings, and she understood it was him and not Vernon. and the stillness in her body changed from the waiting kind to the simply standing kind, which was different in ways she could not have explained to anyone who had not lived them. Holt poured his coffee. He did not speak. He stood near the back window and drank it, looking out at the dark, which in November in Montana was a darkness that had weight and texture to it. Not just the absence of light, but the presence of something else cold and patient and old. Clara went back to her eggs. She was halfway through the bacon laid out in rows with the precision of someone who had been told once that uneven bacon was a sign of a disordered mind when Holt set his cup down on the counter near the door. Not on the table. On the counter carefully with a deliberateness that was not loud. He said without turning around, without looking at her, "Ground's frozen hard past the north fence. Ice on the path from the bunkhouse. Somebody should put down sand before the men come through." He was not asking her to do it. She understood this because in 8 months, he had never once asked her to do anything that was not cooking. He was simply noting it the way a man notes weather as information offered to the room. "I'll tell Chet," she said. "He already knows." A pause. "I just thought you should know in case you go out that way this morning." He left then. The door closed behind him, and the kitchen settled back into its particular silence, the sound of grease in the pan and wind finding the gap above the window frame, and the distant sound of horses in the barn beginning to register the approaching morning. Clara stood at the stove and looked at the cup he had left on the counter. He had drunk it all, and he had set it down with the handle facing outward. She noticed the way you placed a cup when you intended someone to pick it up easily. It was a small thing. A cup handle facing a particular direction in a kitchen at 4 in the morning in November in Montana in 1885 was not the kind of thing a person built a thought around. She picked it up and washed it and did not build a thought around it. Vernon came in at 7, which was later than usual, and Clara felt the difference in the room before she saw his face. She had developed this over 18 months, the way a person develops a scar, not intentionally, but through repeated exposure to the same damage. The air in a room changed when Vernon Pruitt entered it. Not because he was loud. He was rarely loud in public. Because he was always underneath everything calculating. He was good-looking in the way of men who know they are good-looking, which is a particular kind of handsome that has nothing to do with warmth. Dark hair that lay flat and neat even at 7 in the morning. A jaw that could have been drawn by someone who was trying to illustrate what a reliable man looked like. He nodded to the 3 ranch hands already at the table, said something low and easy that made one of them laugh, and pulled out his chair with the comfort of a man who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. He sat. Clara set a plate in front of him. "Eggs look good," he said to no one in particular. Then quieter, while she was still close enough to hear and no one else was, "You sleep all right?" It was the question he always asked the morning after, not an apology. Vernon did not apologize. It was more like a check, a confirmation that the previous night's accounting was closed and they were beginning a new ledger. Clara said, "Fine." "Good." He cut into his eggs. "I didn't sleep well. Too warm in that cabin. You should crack the window before bed." She said nothing. She went back to the stove. The thing about Vernon that had taken her the longest to understand, that she was still in the process of understanding, was that he was not simply cruel. Cruelty, she had learned, was almost easier to navigate than what Vernon actually was, which was a man who genuinely believed his own accounting. He had married her when other men had not, when other men had looked at her body and decided she was not worth the particular arithmetic of permanence. He had offered her his name and his income, and what he called with complete sincerity, his love. He was certain that these things created a debt. He was certain that when she failed to make adequate payment on that debt, correction was not only his right, but his responsibility. He had said this to her once plainly, not in anger, in the same tone he used to explain the price of cattle. She had been 22 years old, and she had not known yet that the plainness of it was the most frightening part. She refilled coffee cups down the table. Old Chet Darrow, 60, and creased as worn leather, tilted his cup in her direction without looking up from the harness he was inspecting at the end of the table. He never thanked her. He also never made a remark about her size or her slowness on the difficult mornings or the way she held herself when she carried something heavy. In Clara's current economy, the absence of harm had come to register as something close to kindness. Holt came in last. He took the chair at the head of the table, which was his chair, in the way that everything on this ranch was his, inherited from a father who had broken this land into something workable before the land broke him back. He was not a man who made announcements about ownership. He simply occupied a space, and the space reorganized itself around him. He did not look at Clara when she set his plate down. He did not look at Vernon either. He looked at his food, and then at the window, and then at Chet, and he said, "North fence post by the creek is loose again after breakfast." Chet grunted agreement. Vernon, from the other end of the table, said pleasantly, "Clara, these biscuits are the best thing you make. You know that." He said it to the table at large, inclusive, generous. Then, "Better than the roast anyway." A small laugh shared with the man sitting next to him. "She still hasn't gotten the roast quite right. But the biscuits, I keep telling her, stick to what you're good at." The table received this the way tables receive most things in working ranch kitchens, with the mild inattention of men focused on getting through a meal before the day demanded them. It was not a comment that would have made any reasonable person look up. Holt looked up. He did not say anything. He looked at Vernon for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has just heard something he is filing for later, and then he looked back at his plate and ate his breakfast. Clara carried the empty coffee pot back to the stove. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She had gotten very good at keeping her hands steady. May Sutton arrived late in the morning with a bundle of mended work shirts wrapped in brown paper. She was the wife of the Granger Ranch's head hand, 30 years old and built for endurance in the way of women who had never had the option of being built for anything else. She had a round face and an opinion about nearly everything, and the particular directness of someone who had learned that softness was a luxury that cost more than she could afford. She set the shirts on the kitchen table and helped herself to coffee without asking, which she always did, and sat down across from Clara, who was peeling potatoes for the noon meal. May watched her peel for a moment. "You're favoring your right side again," May said. "I pulled something. You've been pulling the same something for 6 weeks." Clara set down the potato she was working on and looked at the wall above May's head. Outside, she could hear the men working the north fence, the rhythmic sound of a post driver, the occasional voice. "There's a doctor," May said. "Woman named Agnes Foote. She set up in Delaware 2 months ago. I know you heard about her." "I heard." "She keeps records, Clara. Proper medical records, written down." "I don't need a doctor." "No, but you might need what a doctor writes down." May wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing their words with care, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that the wrong word delivered too quickly would close a door she needed to keep open. "I'm not pushing you. I just want you to know the door is there." Clara picked up the potato again. The peeling curled away in a long ribbon and dropped into the bowl. May said, "My husband used to throw things, not at me, near me. He always said it was near me." She looked at her coffee. "I kept telling myself there was a difference." The potato peeling continued. Neither of them spoke for a while. "How did it stop?" Clara finally asked. She was looking at the potato, not at May. "I told him I would walk to the sheriff's office in Delaware myself in the snow in January, and I would tell Ray Kinch everything I knew about the cattle he sold that didn't belong to him." May's voice was entirely matter-of-fact. "He never threw anything again. Vernon doesn't have a secret like that. Not that you know of yet." Clara looked at her then. May reached into the pocket of her apron and set a small folded piece of paper on the table between them. "Agnes Foote, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Tell her May sent you. She won't ask questions you don't want to answer. She'll just write down what she sees." The paper sat on the table. Outside, the post driver struck again and again, steady as a clock. Clara did not pick up the paper while May was there, but when May left, she folded it once more and put it in the pocket of her apron, and she kept it there through the rest of the potato peeling and through the noon meal and through the long afternoon of bread making. And she did not take it out again, but she was aware of it the entire time, the way you are aware of something small and important that you are not yet ready to look at directly. Old Chet Darrow had worked the Granger land for 22 years, and in that time he had known 3 generations of the family's grief. He was not a sentimental man. Sentiment was for people who had time for it, and Chet had spent 22 years not having time. but he was observant, in the way that men who spend their lives watching animals and weather develop an eye for the particular language of things that cannot speak for themselves. He watched Holt Granger the way he watched the sky in November. Not because he expected disaster, but because he knew the signs of it, and he preferred to be ready. He had noticed the same thing Holt had noticed. He had noticed it 3 weeks before Holt, in fact, because Chet's particular talent was noticing things that people would prefer he did not notice. He had seen the way Clara Pruitt moved in the kitchen. He had seen the way she positioned herself near the stove with a clear line to the back door. He had seen the way her eyes tracked Vernon Pruitt across a room, the way a wild thing tracked a dog, not in terror, but in the specific attention of something that had learned the cost of being caught off guard. He had not said anything. It was not his business. It was not his ranch, and Clara Pruitt was not his concern, and Vernon Pruitt had not done anything in his sight that required him to speak. But he had started keeping a record, not because anyone asked him to, because Chet had lived long enough to know that the truth had a habit of needing witnesses, and witnesses had a habit of forgetting, and paper did not forget. He kept a small notebook in the inner pocket of his coat, the kind sold at the general store in Delaware for keeping accounts. Every time he saw something, he wrote it down. The date, the time, what he observed. Not his interpretation of it, just what he saw with his 2 working eyes in plain daylight. He had 12 entries now. He was adding the 13th, a Tuesday evening 3 weeks into November, when Holt found him sitting behind the hay barn with his notebook on his knee. Holt sat down on the fence rail above him. He did not ask what Chet was writing. He looked out at the north pasture for a while. Then he said, "Tell me what you know about Vernon Pruitt." Chet closed the notebook. "What kind of knowing are you asking about?" "The kind you write down in a book you think nobody sees." Chet was quiet for a moment. He was not embarrassed. He was simply deciding how much of what he knew was Holt's business and how much of it was only his own, and where exactly the line between those two things fell. "I know what I see," Chet said finally. "I don't know what happens in that cabin." "What do you see?" "I see a woman who knows how to make herself small." Chet turned the notebook in his hands. "I see a man who thinks that's a compliment." Holt was quiet for a long time after that. The light was going out of the sky in the way it did in Montana in November, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had simply decided to end the day. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of those minutes. "Eleanor," Holt said finally. And it was not a sentence, just the name set down like something heavy. Chet said nothing. "She wrote me a letter before she left." Holt was still looking at the pasture. "She said I built walls and then acted confused when people couldn't get through them. She wasn't wrong. No." He said it without self-pity, which was one of the things Chet had always respected about him. Holt Granger could be wrong and acknowledge it in the same flat tone he acknowledged the weather. She wasn't wrong about most of it. "Why are you telling me this now?" Holt did not answer immediately. He watched a group of starlings cross the darkening sky, moving the way they always did, as if the whole flock was one breathing thing that had not yet decided where it was going. "Because I stood by and watched a thing go wrong once," he said, "and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I was right that it wasn't my business, and I have regretted being right about that every day for 4 years." Chet turned the notebook over in his hands again. He thought about 12 entries. He thought about a 13th. "I'll keep writing things down," he said. Holt nodded once and stood up from the fence rail and walked back toward the barn without another word. Chet opened his notebook and wrote the date and the time and spoke with HG regarding VPHG aware. HG watching. He closed it, put it back in his coat pocket, and sat for a while longer in the cold, looking at the place where the starlings had been. The letter was in the bottom drawer of the oak desk in the ranch office under a land deed and 2 years of cattle records and a broken watch that had belonged to Holt's father. Clara found it on a Wednesday afternoon in late November when she was cleaning the office as she did every 2 weeks, and the drawer came open too far because the runner was warped and everything in it shifted forward, and the letter slid out from under the deed and landed face up on the floor at her feet. She would not have read it. She was not a person who read other people's private papers. She had been accused of enough things she had not done to be careful about the ones she could control. But the letter was face up, and the first line was already in her eyes before she understood what she was looking at. It was a woman's handwriting, precise and slightly tilted, the handwriting of someone who had been properly schooled and had stopped caring whether it showed. Holt, it began. I am writing this because I cannot say it out loud without you turning away from me, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to do with it. Clara picked it up. She should not have. She read it anyway. It was not a letter full of cruelty. That was the first thing. She had expected bitterness, the kind of letter a leaving woman writes to a man she has decided to hate because hating is cleaner than the alternative. This was not that. Eleanor Granger, who had left this ranch and this man 4 years ago, had written a letter of such precise and unsentimental honesty that Clara had to stop twice and look at the wall before she could continue. She wrote that Holt was the most decent man she had ever known, and that decency was not the same as openness. And she had needed openness, and she had spent 3 years pressing her hands against a wall that was never going to have a door in it. And she was tired. She was not angry. She was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the work, which was considerable, and everything to do with being loved by a man who did not know how to let someone love him back. She wrote, "You will think I am saying you did something wrong. I am not saying that. I am saying that the wall you built to keep out the things that hurt you also keeps out the things that don't. I needed to be let in, Holt. You never once let me in." Clara set the letter on the desk. She looked at the window, which showed her the side yard and the water barrel, and in the distance the north pasture, where Holt was visible as a dark shape against the brown grass, working alone at something near the fence line, which was where he always was when she looked for him without meaning to. She thought about her own reflection in the kitchen window that she always looked away from. She thought about a man who had built a wall so solid and so permanent that the woman who loved him had written him a letter explaining it and then left anyway. She thought about the particular loneliness of that. Not Vernon's kind of loneliness, which was predatory, which fed on other people's smallness. A different kind. The kind that did not know it was lonely because it had always been there. She put the letter back exactly as she had found it. She went back to the cleaning. She did not think about it for the rest of the day. This was not true. She thought about it for the rest of the day, and through the evening meal, and through the long, dark hours of the night when Vernon slept beside her with the heavy, untroubled sleep of a man at peace with his own accounting, and she lay on her side of the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about walls. It was May who brought the news on a Friday morning at the end of November, and she brought it in the tight-jawed way of a woman carrying something that she would rather put down than carry any longer. She came into the kitchen before breakfast, before the hands were up, before Vernon had stirred. She came in, and she looked at Clara, and she said without a greeting, "I found out something about your husband." Clara set down the bread knife. "Tell me. He had a wife before you." May was watching Clara's face carefully. Her name was Delia. Delia Marsh before she married him. She left him in 1882. Clara said nothing. "She filed papers," May continued. "At the county courthouse. Delia filed papers against him, legal papers, a complaint. She had cause, Clara. Real documented cause." Still, Clara said nothing. Her hands were flat on the counter and she was looking at them. "The complaint disappeared," May said, "before it ever reached the judge. It was just gone. And the man who made it go away was a friend of Vernon's father, who at the time happened to be the county commissioner." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was finding every gap in the old walls, the soft, constant whisper of cold air looking for a way in. Clara said, "Where is she now, Delia?" "Idaho. She remarried. She's all right." May paused. "I have her address." Clara looked up from her hands. "She wrote to me," May said. "I reached out through a woman I know in Billings who knows someone in Idaho, and she wrote back. She knew Vernon had married again. She's been thinking about writing to you herself." The bread knife was still where Clara had put it down. She picked it up again. She turned back to the bread. She began cutting, and her hands were not steady, but she kept cutting anyway. "He's done this before," she said. It was not a question. It had the sound of something being named for the first time, something that had existed without a name for a long time, and the naming of it was a different kind of weight than the unnamed thing had been. Heavier in one way, easier to carry in another. "He has a system," May said quietly. "That's what she wrote. It's not accidents and it's not losing his temper. It's a system, Clara. And the system includes knowing how to make sure there are no consequences. Clara cut the last slice of bread. She set the knife down on the board. She stood with her back to May and looked at the wall above the stove where she had hung a small calendar from the Miles City dry goods store, a practical thing with pictures of mountains she had never seen. And she looked at the current date, which was November 22nd, 1885, and she counted forward the way she counted everything. "How long," she said, "does a legal case take if someone were to file?" May did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was careful with something that might have been hope, which was a delicate thing to carry in a ranch kitchen in Montana in November at 5 in the morning. "Agnes Foote," May said, "keeps records." Clara turned around. She held out her hand. May looked at the hand. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out the piece of paper she had brought back, because she had known with the patient certainty of a woman who understood these things that Clara would ask for it today. Clara took it. She did not put it in her apron this time. She folded it once and held it in her closed fist. Through the kitchen window across the frozen yard, the light in the bunkhouse had come on. The day was beginning. In 2 hours, 18 men would need to be fed, and the stove needed tending, and the biscuits were not yet in the pan. Clara Pruitt, who weighed more than the world had decided she should, and had spent 24 years being reminded of it, who had learned to count footsteps and measure the weight of a boot heel, and make herself small in rooms that were already small, stood in the kitchen that was hers for the hours before anyone else claimed it. And she breathed in through the pain in her ribs all the way in and let it out slow. She had a name. She had an address in Idaho. She had a doctor who kept records. And she had a husband who believed she had nowhere to go. He was going to learn that he was wrong about that. She opened her fist and looked at the paper. Agnes Foote, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today was Friday. She could wait until Tuesday. She put the paper in her dress pocket against her side where the ribs were healing wrong, and she turned back to the stove. The biscuits were not going to make themselves. Tuesday came the way all important days come in hard country, without ceremony, dressed like any other day. The sky was the color of old tin, and the wind came down off the peaks with the particular meanness of December wind, which was not interested in whether you were ready for it. Clara told Vernon she was going to Deller for flour and salt and a spool of heavy thread for mending. These were things that were needed. She had made sure of it, had let the flour bin run lower than she would normally allow, and had checked twice that the salt was genuinely low before she said anything. Vernon had a sharp eye for pretense. She had learned not to give him anything to find. He looked at her for a moment over his coffee cup. This was what he did when he was deciding something. This particular stillness that was not relaxed, but calculating the stillness of a man running numbers in his head. "Take the small wagon," he said. "Be back before dark." "Yes." "And Clara." He said it to his cup, not to her face. "Stop at the dry goods first. Don't wander." She said yes again, and she did not wander. Not exactly, but she went to the dry goods last instead of first, and in the hour between her arrival in Deller and her arrival at the dry goods store, she pushed open a door on the south side of Merchant Street that had a small painted sign above it reading, "Agnes Foote, M.D., and underneath that, in smaller letters, "By appointment or by need." The office was one room with a curtained area for examination, and a desk and 2 chairs and a smell of carbolic soap and pine wood and something herbal she could not identify. It was the cleanest room she had been in since she left her mother's house. Agnes Foote was 51 years old and had a face that had stopped apologizing for itself sometime around 30 and had not looked back. She was not a large woman, but she occupied her space completely the way certain people do, without any wasted motion or unnecessary softness. She looked at Clara the way a good doctor looks at a patient, which is to say, she looked at all of it, not just the parts that were presented to her. "May Sutton sent me," Clara said. "I know who sends people to me," Agnes said. "Sit down." Clara sat. Agnes did not ask what was wrong. She looked at the way Clara sat, which was forward and to the left, protecting her right side, and she said, "How long ago?" 5 weeks. "How many?" "I think 3. Ribs." Agnes stood up and came around the desk. "I'm going to examine you. I'll tell you everything I'm doing before I do it. You tell me if you want me to stop." No one had said that to Clara before. She did not know what to do with it immediately. She noted it and kept it one more thing that required more time to understand than she currently had. The examination was thorough and quiet, and Agnes narrated each step in a voice that was clinical without being cold, which was its own particular skill. She noted the ribs, which had begun to knit, but not cleanly. She noted the older bruising on Clara's upper arms, the kind that had gone through yellow and was fading now. She noted the way Clara held her breath at certain pressures and let it out slowly in a way that had nothing to do with pain management and everything to do with the long practice of not making noise. Afterward, Clara sat in the chair again, and Agnes sat behind her desk and wrote in a large ledger book with a careful hand. She wrote for longer than Clara expected. She wrote the date and the time, and she wrote down everything she had observed in language that was specific and detailed and entirely without interpretation, just the facts of a body and what they indicated and when. She looked up when she was done. "This stays in this book," she said. "This book stays in this office. If you need it, it will be here." "What would I need it for?" Agnes looked at her steadily. "You already know the answer to that, or you wouldn't have come." Clara looked at the desk, at the ledger, at the careful handwriting that described her body's evidence in ink that would not fade the way Bruises faded. "He had a wife before me," Clara said. It was the first time she had said it out loud to anyone other than May. She filed a complaint. It disappeared. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A complaint that disappears in a courthouse is a political problem. A medical record in a private ledger is a different kind of document." She paused. "Different kind of hard to make disappear." Clara stood up. She straightened her coat. She was aware of every rib, and she was aware of the ledger on the desk, and she was aware of something happening in her chest that was not hope exactly, because hope was a thing she had learned to be careful with, but was adjacent to it close enough to feel the warmth of it without committing to the thing itself. "Tuesdays and Thursdays," Agnes said. "I heard. You don't have to have a reason, you can just come." Clara nodded once. She went out into the December cold and stood for a moment on the step outside the door and let the wind come at her straight on, which she normally did not do because she had learned not to offer anything a direct target. She stood there anyway. The wind was very cold and very impartial, and did not have an opinion about her size or her choices or whether she deserved what had been done to her. She went to the dry goods store and bought flour and salt and thread. She was back at the ranch before dark. Vernon looked at the supplies without comment. He ate his supper without comment. He went to bed without comment. Clara lay in the dark for a long time looking at the ceiling, thinking about ink in a ledger that would not disappear. The thing about working for Holt Granger, Clara had come to understand, was that he had a very precise and personal definition of what constituted his business and what did not. His business was the land and the cattle and the men he employed, and the structures that stood on the 12,000 acres he had inherited from his father. What happened inside those structures between the people who lived in them was not his business in any way that he would have volunteered an opinion about. He was not a man who volunteered opinions, but he was a man who noticed things and kept them without drama, without announcement in some private accounting of his own that no one else had access to. Clara noticed him noticing the way you notice a large and quiet animal at the edge of your vision, not threateningly, just there. It was a Wednesday evening in the second week of December when the pipe under the kitchen sink came apart at the joint. She found it at 9 o'clock at night when she went back to the kitchen for the mending she had left there, and water was running across the floor in a thin sheet that had already reached the far wall. She found the shut-off under the cabinet and closed it. She looked at the separated pipe in the light of the lantern she was holding. The fitting had simply given way, old iron giving up on a cold night. She did not know how to fix it, and she knew that this was not the kind of problem that waited until morning, because water in a wall in winter in Montana became ice, and ice became structural damage, and structural damage on Holt Granger's ranch was her responsibility to report, even if the fixing of it was not. She went to the main house door and knocked. He answered quickly enough that she thought he might not have been sleeping. He was dressed at least, or close enough to it, boots not laced, shirt untucked, and he looked at her in the light of the lantern she was still carrying, and then passed her toward the kitchen building without her having to say anything. "Pipe," she said. He took the lantern from her hand and went to the kitchen. She followed. He looked at the pipe for a moment, crouching in the cramped space under the sink with the lantern held in one hand and his other hand on the broken fitting. He was too large for the space and managed it anyway. He said, "I've got the fitting for this in the barn. Won't take long. I can do it tomorrow if you want to go back to sleep. It'll freeze by tomorrow." He went to the barn and came back with the fitting and a pipe wrench and fixed it in 20 minutes without asking for help and without providing unnecessary commentary on the process. Clara stood near the stove and watched and said nothing either, and the kitchen was quiet except for the wind and the sound of the wrench on old iron. When he was done, he stood up and dried his hands on a cloth. She handed him and looked at the now intact pipe under the sink with the look of a man confirming that a thing was fixed. He said without looking at her, "You've been going to Agnes' foot." It was not a question. She did not know how he knew, and she did not ask. "Yes," she said. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already concluded. He set the wrench on the counter. "My wife left 4 years ago," he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation, as if he were identifying a piece of equipment. "Eleanor. She said I was a wall she couldn't get through." Clara stood still. "I've been thinking about that letter for 4 years," he said. "Whether she was right. Was she—" He looked at the pipe under the sink. "Probably." The wind found the gap above the window and pushed through it in a soft moan. The lantern flame moved. "I'm not the kind of man who talks well," he said. "I never have been. My father was the same. We could work alongside a man for 30 years and not know his first name. It wasn't rudeness, it was just—" He stopped, tried again. Just the way the words weren't there when they should have been. Clara said, "Some things don't need words." He looked at her then, directly, the way he rarely did, which made the times he did have a weight to them. "The morning after I first noticed how you were walking," he said, "I almost asked you straight out. Figured it was the honest thing." He picked up his coat from the chair where he had draped it. "Then I thought about what it would cost you if I asked and you said no, and then had to keep working here like I hadn't." The lantern light moved again. Outside, the cold was absolute. "So I didn't ask," he said, "but I noticed, and I kept noticing." He pulled on his coat. He picked up the lantern and set it on the counter so she would have the light, and he walked to the door. He said with his back to her, his hand on the door frame, "Eleanor was right that I build walls. She wasn't right about everything." He opened the door. The cold came in. There's a difference between not knowing how to let someone in and not wanting to. He left. The door closed. Clara stood in the kitchen by herself for a long time with the sound of the wind and the repaired pipe and the small movements of the lantern flame, and she thought about the letter in the bottom drawer, the precise and honest words of a woman who had pressed her hands against something solid and eventually stopped pressing. She thought about what it meant that Holt Granger knew he was a wall, knew it and was still here, had not left, had not asked her to leave. She turned off the lantern and went to bed and lay in the dark next to Vernon's untroubled sleep. And she stared at the ceiling and she thought that knowing what you are is not the same as knowing how to be different, but it is perhaps the necessary beginning of it. December settled over Granger Ranch like a judgment. The work contracted in the cold, the way work always did, became more essential and less varied, became the feeding of animals and the maintenance of structures and the getting through of days that were short on light and long on everything else. Vernon Pruitt had a quality that Clara had identified in the first months of their marriage and had never found a name for, until May one afternoon had said the word, and the word had fit so precisely that Clara had felt it click into place like a joint finding its socket. The word was surveillance. Vernon was always watching. Not obviously, not with the focused stare of a man who wants you to know you are being watched. With the peripheral attention of a man who has made watching a part of his ordinary posture, a part of the way he held his head and moved through rooms. He knew where Clara was at most hours of the day. He knew who she talked to and for how long. He had not said anything about her Tuesdays and Thursdays in Deller because he did not yet know what Tuesdays and Thursdays meant, and Vernon did not show his hand until he understood what game he was playing. But he was gathering information. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. What changed in December was not that Vernon did anything new. It was that he became less careful about who could see him doing the old things. It started at supper on a Thursday 10 days before Christmas. The table was full 12 men, plus Vernon plus Holt at the head, and the meal was beef stew that Clara had put up before noon and left to develop all afternoon, which was the only way to do it properly. Low heat and time, and it was as good as anything she had made, and she knew it. Vernon looked at his bowl. He stirred it once. He said to the table at large in the easy conversational voice he used when he wanted an audience, "Clara makes a fine stew, always has." He paused, timing it the way he timed things. "She's not much for the variety of it, but what she does well." He smiled at the man across from him. "I tell her play to your strengths. Woman like Clara, the kitchen is her strength." Another pause, lighter this time, almost a laugh. "Lord knows it's not the gardening." 3 men laughed. Not meanly. They laughed the way men laugh at a mild joke from a man they work for. The reflexive laughter of social maintenance. They were not thinking about what the joke meant. They were thinking about their stew. Clara was at the stove. She did not look up. Holt set down his spoon. He did not say anything. He did not look at Vernon. He picked his spoon back up and finished his stew, and at the end of the meal he said to Chet about a fence problem in the South Quarter, and the conversation moved on and nothing happened. Except that when the men filed out afterward and Clara was clearing the table, Vernon came to stand near her while she worked, and he said very quietly, "You were looking at Granger again." She said, "I wasn't." "Don't do that. Don't tell me what I didn't see." She stacked the plates and did not answer, and after a moment Vernon walked out and the kitchen was her own again, and she breathed carefully through the particular fear that lived in her stomach. Not panic, but something older and more enduring, something that had set up residence so long ago it felt almost like a physical organ, a second heart that only beat in the wrong direction. She was washing the dishes when she heard boots on the porch step. She did not tighten. She had learned to identify boots by sound, and these were Chet's boots, the slightly uneven gait of a man whose left knee had been broken and healed imperfectly in 1871. He came to the door and knocked on the frame. "Mrs. Pruitt?" "Come in, Chet." He came in and stood near the door with his hat in his hands, which was how he stood when he was about to say something that he had thought about for a while before saying it. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, which Clara found restful. "I want you to know," he said, "that if you ever needed to say something to someone and have it written down, I keep a notebook." Clara looked at him. "Just observation," he said. "What I see, what I hear, dated and timed. I've been keeping it since October." He turned the hat in his hands. "I'm not telling you what to do with that information. I'm just telling you it exists." She looked at this old man with his crooked knee and his notebook and his 22 years of seeing everything that happened on this land, and she thought about systems. About the system Vernon had used to make Delia's complaint disappear. About the system Agnes Foote was building in her ledger, one entry at a time in ink that would not disappear. About the fact that Vernon had his own system and had believed for 18 months that she had no system at all. "Thank you, Chet," she said. He put his hat back on and went out. Clara finished the dishes. Her hands were steady. Agnes Foote had received her own letter that January from the County Medical Board, informing her that her license to practice in Montana Territory was under review, pending a formal complaint filed by 3 members of the Delaware Town Council who believed that a woman practicing medicine without a male supervising physician was operating outside the bounds of established professional conduct. She had written back in the same level-specific language she used for everything, noting that her degree was from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, that she had practiced without incident for 11 years in 2 states, and that she would be happy to discuss the matter at the board's earliest convenience. She had then gone back to seeing patients. She told Clara about it on a Thursday in the second week of January, not for sympathy, but because she thought Clara should know that the women helping her were not doing so without cost. "Are you going to be all right?" Clara asked. "Yes," Agnes said. She closed the ledger and set her pen down. "So are you." Clara looked at this woman who had built something careful and useful in a place that did not want her to build it, and she thought about what it meant to keep working when the ground beneath you was uncertain. May's husband was a large, quiet man named George Sutton, who had the particular gift of being present in a room without asserting himself in it. He had worked the Granger Ranch for 7 years, and he had known Vernon Pruitt for 8 months, and in that time he had formed a view of the man that he kept to himself, because it was not his place to voice it, and because May did the voicing for both of them in any case. It was George who told May on a Saturday evening that Vernon had been asking questions. May told Clara on Sunday morning in the kitchen in the brief window between the time Vernon left for the barn and the time the hands came in for breakfast. He asked George about Tuesdays, May said, whether he'd noticed where you went. Clara's hands did not stop moving over the biscuit dough. What did George say? George said he didn't keep track of where the cook went on her days off, and Vernon should ask you himself. May watched Clara's hands. George doesn't know that's the wrong answer to give a man like that. It's the honest answer. Honest and safe aren't the same thing. Clara knew this better than May needed to tell her. She worked the dough and thought about timing. Vernon now knew she went to Deller on Tuesdays. He would find out about Agnes' foot within a week, probably less. There were not many reasons a woman made regular visits to a doctor she had not visited before. Vernon was not unintelligent. He would understand what it meant. I need to move faster than I have been, Clara said. May said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I need to know if Delia would testify. Clara shaped the biscuits with efficient hands, set them in the pan. Not by letter, in person, if it came to it. May was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing to ask of her. I know it. She's built a new life in Idaho. She's got a husband. Asking her to come back and stand in a courtroom and talk about Vernon Pruitt in front of a town full of people who never heard of her. I know what I'm asking. Clara slid the pan into the oven. She turned to face May for the first time in the conversation. Her face was not distressed. It was the face of a woman doing arithmetic. I also know that if she had a witness in 1882, if someone had stood up and said what they knew, I might not be standing here right now with 3 ribs that healed wrong. May looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, I'll write to her. Kit Pruitt arrived at Granger Ranch on a Monday in the 3rd week of December, having ridden from the town of Harlan, where he worked at a livery stable owned by a man he owed a favor. He was 22 years old and had the look of a man who had not yet finished becoming whoever he was going to be, unformed around the edges with Vernon's jaw, but none of Vernon's stillness. All of his movements slightly too large for the spaces he moved through. He came because Vernon had sent for him. This was not unusual. Vernon used Kit the way certain men use younger brothers, as a resource to be drawn on when needed, as a loyalty that could be assumed and never questioned. Kit had never questioned it. He had grown up in Vernon's shadow the way plants grow in inadequate light, reaching always in the direction of what warmth was available. He came into the kitchen the first morning because the kitchen was where the food was, which was where he always went first, and he stood in the doorway and looked at Clara in the way young men look at women they have heard about but not formed a full picture of, taking inventory without subtlety. Clara said, "Sit down, coffee's hot." He sat.
You don't have to pretend with me, girl.
He took the coffee. He looked around the kitchen with the alert curiosity of someone cataloging a new place. "Vernon talks about your cooking," he said. "Does he? Says you're the best he's had." A pause. "He also says you're stubborn." "He said that to me too." Kit wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He had Pruitt hands, she noticed, wide across the knuckles, built for work. But he held the cup the way someone holds a cup when they are cold and grateful for the warmth, not the way Vernon held things, which was always as if the thing might be taken from him. "He asked you to come watch me," Clara said. Kit looked up from his coffee, startled enough that she knew the answer before he gave it. "He just said he needed help with winter work," Kit said. "All right." She went back to the bread she was making. Kit drank his coffee and watched her work with the slightly bewildered attention of someone who had expected a different kind of woman and was not yet sure what to do with the one in front of him. "You're not what I thought you'd be," he said. "What did you think I'd be?" He considered this with more seriousness than she had expected. "Softer, maybe? Vernon makes it sound like." He stopped. "Like what?" Kit looked at his cup. "Like you need a lot of managing." The bread dough moved under her hands, steady and rhythmic. "Every person is someone's version of a story," she said. "You're hearing Vernon's version." He did not have an answer for this. He finished his coffee and put the cup in the sink and went out to find his brother, and Clara watched him go and thought about the particular tragedy of a young man who has learned loyalty before he has learned discernment, and how those two things, once tangled, are very hard to separate. Over the following week, she watched Kit watch her. He was not subtle about it, which was either guileless or strategic, and she was not yet sure which. He watched her interact with the ranch hands, and he watched her interact with Holt, and he watched her interact with Vernon, and she knew he was watching because Vernon had asked him to, and she also knew because she was good at reading the machinery of people that what Kit was seeing was not what Vernon had told him he would see. She did not perform anything differently for Kit's benefit. She simply continued to be the person she was in this kitchen, which was competent and quiet and entirely without the dependence and disorder that Vernon's version of her required. Kit began helping her with things without being asked, moving heavy pots, bringing in wood without being told the box was low. It was not courtship, nothing like that. It was more like the behavior of a man whose hands wanted to be useful and who had found a useful thing to do. She did not encourage it, and she did not discourage it. She simply noted it and continued working. On the Thursday before Christmas, Vernon came to the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon when no one else was there. This was unusual enough that Clara noted the departure from pattern before she noted anything else. He closed the door behind him. He did not sit down. He stood in the center of the kitchen in his coat, which meant he had come directly from outside and had not taken the time to hang it, which meant he was not here for conversation. He said, "You've been seeing the doctor in Deller." She was at the table sorting dried beans for the following day's meal. She continued sorting. "I've been having trouble with my breathing," she said. "I thought it should be looked at." Agnes Foote. "Yes. She's a woman doctor." He said this as if it were a relevant fact that reflected poorly on both of them. "She has a medical degree and an office." Vernon was quiet for a moment. She could feel the temperature of him from across the table. Not body heat, but something else, the particular energy of a man recalibrating. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "About my breathing." "Clara." His voice was very level, very patient. It was the most dangerous register of him, this patient levelness, because it meant he was certain of his ground. "I am asking you a simple question, and I am asking you to answer it simply. What did you tell Agnes Foote?" She looked up from the beans. She looked at him directly, which she did not always do, which he did not always permit without consequence. She looked at him, and she said, "I told her the truth about my body. That is what you tell a doctor." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight. "I see," Vernon said. He did not move. He did not raise his voice. He stood in the center of the kitchen in his coat, and he looked at her with the look of a man updating his calculations. And then he said, "I hope you understand that whatever you said in that office, a doctor's notes are private. They don't come into a courtroom. They don't go anywhere." He turned and opened the door and walked out. The cold came in briefly, and then the door closed and the cold was gone, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary again. Clara sat at the table with her hands in the beans. She sorted one bean from the pile, then another. Her hands were not entirely steady now. They were close, but not entirely. She thought about what he had said, about doctor's notes being private, about them not going anywhere. He did not know about Chet's notebook. He thought Agnes Foote was her only evidence. He was wrong about that, and she had not corrected him, because she had learned in 18 months of living with this man that the most important information you had was the information he did not know you had. She finished sorting the beans. She put them to soak overnight. She made the supper. Vernon ate it pleasantly, spoke easily with the men, was the best version of himself that she had ever seen him be, because that was what he did when he believed he had closed a problem. He relaxed into the certainty of his own control, the way a fist relaxes when it has found the grip it was looking for. Clara watched him from the stove. She thought about Delia in Idaho. She thought about Agnes Foote's ledger. She thought about Chet's notebook growing heavier with each week that passed. She thought about a woman in a county courthouse in 1882 whose complaint had disappeared because the system had swallowed it. She thought about what it would take to build a system of her own that was harder to swallow. Vernon laughed at something Pete said and refilled his own coffee and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had never once doubted that the chair belonged to him. Clara poured coffee for the men down the table and did not look at him, and thought, with a clarity that was cold and clean and absolute as the December air outside the kitchen walls, that doubt was coming for him. It was taking its time. It was being careful about the route it traveled. but it was coming, and she was going to be ready when it arrived. Kit found her after supper when she was outside hauling ash from the kitchen stove to the ash pile near the garden. He came out without his coat, which meant he had come on impulse, and he stood in the cold with his arms folded against his chest and his breath making brief clouds in the dark air. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're already outside in December without a coat," she said. "It must be important." He almost smiled at this. Almost. "Vernon told me something about you, before I came, about why you've been." He stopped, reorganized. "He said you've been difficult, since the fall, that you'd gotten some ideas about things." Clara emptied the ash bucket onto the pile. She tapped it twice against her palm to clear it. "What kind of ideas?" she said. He didn't say exactly. Kit was watching her in the way he had been watching her all week, that inventory-taking attention. "But I've been here 8 days, and I've watched you, and I don't see what he's describing." She looked at him then, this young man with his brother's jaw and his own confusion standing in the December dark without a coat because something had bothered him enough to come out without thinking about the temperature. "Kit," she said, "what does your brother tell you about himself?" He blinked. "What do you mean? When he talks about his life, about his marriage, about the way things are between us, what does he tell you?" Kit was quiet for a moment. "That he provides for you, that he tries, that you're—" He stopped again. "That I'm what?" "That you're not easy," Kit said. He says it like he's tired of something. Clara nodded slowly. She held the empty ash bucket at her side. "I want you to do something for me," she said. "Not for my sake, just as an exercise in seeing clearly." She kept her voice even informational. "I want you to watch how he talks about me when I'm in the room, not what he says, how he says it. And then I want you to watch how he talks about me when he thinks I can't hear. And I want you to notice if those two things are different." Kit looked at her. "That's all," she said. "Just notice." She went back inside with the empty bucket. The door closed behind her. She stood in the warmth of the kitchen and listened to the sound of Kit's boots on the frozen ground after a long moment going back toward the bunkhouse. She had not told him anything. She had not asked him for anything. She had simply offered him the use of his own eyes. What he did with that was his decision. His own decision made without her influence, without Vernon's instruction, without anyone telling him what to conclude. She had learned that there were some doors you could not push open for a person. You could only show them where the door was and let them decide whether to try the handle. She hung up the ash bucket and washed her hands and started the next morning's bread. And outside, the wind came down off the mountain, carrying everything the mountain knew about patience, which was considerable, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of yeast, and the future, which was still uncertain, but was for the first time in a long time beginning to feel like something she had a hand in shaping. She worked until 10 o'clock. Then she went to her cabin, and she lay down in the dark next to Vernon's sleeping form, and she looked at the ceiling and she counted forward, not footsteps this time, but days. 14 days until she planned to speak to the lawyer in Delaware that Agnes Foote had mentioned quietly on her second visit. 14 days. She could manage 14 days. She had managed 312. 14 was nothing. She closed her eyes and she did not sleep immediately, but she was not afraid, which was different from the not sleeping of fear, which was different in every way that mattered, and she lay in the dark, counting forward. And outside, the wind spoke in the particular voice of Montana in December, which was the voice of something old and indifferent and entirely honest about what it was. And she thought that honesty, even cold honesty, was something you could navigate. It was the dishonest things that could kill you if you let them. She did not intend to let them. January in Montana was not a month. It was a condition. It settled over the land with the permanence of something that had always been there and intended to stay, and it made the distances between things feel larger than they were. The distance between the ranch and the town, between one decision and the next, between the person you had been and the person you were trying to become. Clara had made her appointment with the lawyer on a Tuesday, the same day she went to Agnes Foote, and she had sat in a small cold office above the dry goods store in Delaware, across from a man named Samuel Greer, who had a careful face and ink-stained fingers and the particular patience of someone who had heard difficult things before, and understood that the hearing of them was part of his work. She told him everything, not the way she had told May in pieces with the careful rationing of someone unsure of her audience. She told him all of it in order from the beginning, with the dates she remembered and the ones she had to estimate and the names of the people who had seen what they had seen. She told him about Agnes Foote and the ledger. She told him about Chet's notebook. She told him about Delia. Greer had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Delia Pruitt. She's willing to come. May had a letter from her last week. She's willing." He wrote something. "Mrs. Pruitt, I want to be honest with you about what you're facing. Divorce on grounds of cruelty in Montana Territory in 1886 is possible. It has been done, but it requires the court to believe your account over your husband's, and courts in this territory are not accustomed to doing that without significant corroboration. I have corroboration. You have a doctor's records, a ranch hand's notebook, and a former wife who will have to travel from Idaho to testify. That is more than most women come to me with." He paused. "It is not nothing. But Vernon Pruitt will have a lawyer, and that lawyer will work to discredit each of those things in turn. I know that. You need to know it fully, not just in principle." He looked at her steadily. "They will question your character. They will ask about your history. They will suggest that a woman of your—" He stopped, chose his word carefully. "Circumstances might have reasons other than the stated ones to seek dissolution of a marriage that provides her with stability and income." Clara looked at him. "By circumstances, you mean my size." He did not look away from her directness. "I mean that opposing counsel will attempt to use any available characteristic to suggest instability or unreliability. Size, background, the fact that you worked at a boarding house in Miles City before your marriage, which they will describe in the least charitable terms available. That boarding house was a legitimate establishment. I believe you. The question is whether 12 men in a jury box will believe you when opposing counsel is finished with the description of it." The office was very cold. Clara sat in the hard chair across from Samuel Greer and looked at the frosted window and thought about 12 men in a jury box. She thought about what they would see when they looked at her. A large woman. A woman without family in this territory. A woman whose husband was handsome and easy and would stand before them in a good suit with a lawyer from the county seat. She thought about Delia's letter, which May had read aloud to her twice. The plain factual language of a woman describing what had been done to her body in the specific terms of someone who had already survived the telling of it. She thought about Agnes Foote's ledger, about Chet's notebook, about the 13 entries that were now 21. She thought about Kit Pruitt standing in the December cold without a coat because something had bothered him enough that he forgot the temperature. "File the papers," she said. Greer filed them the following Thursday. Vernon was served on a Saturday morning standing in the yard of Granger Ranch by a deputy from Delaware named Ray Kinch, who rode out with the document in his coat pocket and the look of a man who would have preferred to be doing almost anything else. Clara watched from the kitchen window. She watched Vernon take the paper from Ray Kinch and open it and read it. She watched his face, which she had spent 18 months learning to read, the way you read difficult terrain for the particular arrangements that signaled what was coming. She watched him read the document twice. She watched him fold it with the careful precision of someone who is doing something with their hands because their hands need something to do. He looked up from the folded paper and his eyes went directly to the kitchen window. Directly, without searching, the way someone looks when they already know where to look. Clara did not move back from the window. They looked at each other across the frozen yard for a long moment. Then Vernon turned back to Ray Kinch and said something, and Kinch nodded and rode out. And Vernon walked toward the barn, and the yard was empty and ordinary again, and Clara turned back to the stove. Holt came into the kitchen an hour later. He poured coffee and sat at the table, which he did now without it requiring notice, sat in the chair nearest the stove where the heat was best, and put his large hands around the cup and looked at her. "Kinch came," he said. "Yes." "Papers served." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You need anything from me in terms of the case? Testimony, whatever they call it?" Clara looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was the primary language he spoke, not words, but presence, the simple, consistent fact of being there. "You might be asked about what you observed," she said, "about how I moved, what you saw. I'll answer truthfully. That's all I'm asking from anyone." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He did not tell her it would be all right, which she appreciated, because it might not be all right, and she had no patience left for the kind of comfort that required the future to cooperate. What he said after a while was, "Eleanor had a lawyer. When she left, I paid his fees because it was the decent thing, and also because I knew she was right even when it was hard to know it." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'm not offering to pay your lawyer's fees because you need me to. I'm offering because it's the decent thing, and it won't change anything between us either way." Clara thought about this. She thought about what she had said to him once in a different conversation about winning on her own terms or not winning at all. She said, "Let me tell you what I'll accept. If I run short before the hearing, I'll ask you. I'll pay it back from my wages. There's no need. There is to me." She looked at him directly. "I've spent 18 months belonging to someone else's financial accounting. I need this to be mine." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "That's fair." They sat in the warm kitchen while outside the January cold pressed against the walls, and the thing between them, which had no name yet and did not need one yet, sat with them quietly, the way certain things sit with you when they are genuine without demanding to be acknowledged before they are ready. Vernon did not leave the ranch. This was the first surprise. Clara had half expected him to go the way a man who knows a battle is lost might choose to withdraw before the losses become humiliating. But Vernon Pruitt was not a man who accepted the premise that battles were lost until the final moment of judgment, and perhaps not even then. He stayed. He worked. He ate at the table with the men and spoke easily and behaved in every observable way, like a man who had been wrongly accused of something and was confident that the truth would correct the misunderstanding. He did not approach Clara directly again after the night he had come to the kitchen. He did not need to. His presence was its own approach, the daily fact of him in her space at her table, breathing the same air in the rooms she moved through. 18 months of that particular education meant that she felt him always a pressure at the edge of everything she did, a weight on the periphery of every room. She managed it. She had been managing it for a year and a half, and she could manage it for the 6 more weeks until the hearing. What she had not anticipated was what he would do outside the ranch. May came to her on a Wednesday in the second week of January with the tight face that Clara had learned to associate with news that needed to be delivered carefully. "He's been talking," May said. They were in the kitchen door, closed voices low. "In town, at the saloon, at the dry goods, wherever men talk. He's building a story." "What story?" May sat down. She folded her hands on the table the way she did when she was organizing something difficult. "He's saying you've been carrying on with Holt Granger, that this whole thing, the filing, the lawyer, all of it is because Granger put you up to it, because Granger wants Vernon off the ranch so he can have you to himself." The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and bread, and Clara stood at the counter and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "He's saying it's not about the abuse," she said. "He's saying there was no abuse. He's saying you invented it as a reason to leave, and Granger helped you invent it because the two of you have been." "I understand what he's saying." Clara turned back to the counter. She picked up the bread knife and set it down again. "Who's listening?" "Enough people." May paused. "Ray Kinch heard it. He told George it gave him something to think about. And you know Ray Kinch is the one who'll be in that courtroom representing the law." This was the system Clara thought. This was the system Vernon had used before in whatever form it had taken in 1882 when Delia had tried and failed. Not brute force. Narrative. The slow, patient construction of a story that was more comfortable to believe than the truth. Because the truth required people to look at something they would rather not look at, which was a woman being damaged by a man they drank with on Saturday nights. She stood at the counter and she thought about narrative. She thought about who got to tell the story and who was told to listen to someone else's version of themselves. She said, "I need to go to town." May looked up. "What?" "Not to argue with him. not to defend myself in the saloon. Clara picked up the bread knife again, began slicing. I need to go to town, and I need to be seen being exactly who I am, going about my business, not hiding, not ashamed. People will stare. People are already talking. At least if I'm there, they're looking at the real thing instead of Vernon's description of it. May was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll go with you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm going. They went on Friday. Clara wore her second best dress, the dark blue wool, and she put her hair up with more care than she usually gave it. Not for vanity, she had made her peace with vanity being a complicated business, but because she understood that presentation was its own language and she intended to speak it clearly. They walked down the main street of Delaware, and the eyes came the way she had known they would. Not hostile, mostly. Curious. The particular curiosity of a small community that has been given a story and wants to compare it to the source material. She walked without hurrying and without the apologetic sideways movement she had spent years cultivating, the instinctive minimizing of herself in public spaces, the effort to take up less room than she actually took up. She took up exactly the room she took up. She walked through it. Martha Ogle, who ran the post office and had strong opinions about most things, stopped her near the dry goods and said without pleasantry, I hear you're divorcing Vernon Pruitt. That's right, Clara said, on grounds of cruelty. That's right. Martha Ogle looked at her for a long moment with eyes that had seen a great deal of this territory's history and had formed views about most of it. My sister had a husband like that, she said. 30 years ago in Ohio. She stayed. She paused. She shouldn't have stayed. She went back into the post office. It was not an endorsement. It was not sympathy exactly. It was something more specific than either of those things. It was one woman saying to another, I see what this is. And Clara received it and kept walking. By the time they reached the end of the main street and turned back, she had been looked at by 40 people and spoken to by 6 and cut by exactly none, which was better than she had expected and worse than she deserved, and precisely the kind of result you learn to accept and work with in a world that was not yet ready to give you everything you were owed. She went home and made supper, and Vernon sat at the end of the table and ate it, and smiled at the men and said nothing directly to her all evening, and she cleared the table and washed the dishes and went to her cabin and lay in the dark and counted 6 more weeks. 5 weeks and 6 days. The hearing was on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. The courtroom in Delaware was the largest room in the county courthouse, which was not a large building, and by 8 in the morning it was full, because in a county of this size in the winter of 1886, a divorce hearing on grounds of cruelty was the most significant thing that had happened since the bank in Miles City was robbed in November, and the people of Delaware were not inclined to miss it. Clara sat beside Samuel Greer at the plaintiff's table, and she put her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she breathed slowly, and she did not look at Vernon, who sat at the other table with his lawyer, a man named Frederick Alcott, who had come from the county seat and had the groomed look of a man who charged accordingly. Judge Abram Cross presided. He was 63 years old and had been on the bench in this territory for 19 years and had the face of a man who had heard most of what human beings were capable of saying to one another and had stopped being surprised by it somewhere around 1874. He was not by reputation a man who was easily worked. He was also, not by reputation, a man who found it natural to rule against a husband in favor of a wife, not because he was cruel, but because the law, as it had been written and as he had applied it for 19 years, was built on a foundation that assumed the husband's account as the default, reasonable position. Clara knew this. Greer had told her. She had listened and had filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things that were true and difficult and still had to be navigated. Greer called Agnes Foote first. Agnes came to the stand with the composure of a woman who had been questioned about her qualifications before and had stopped finding it interesting. Alcott immediately challenged her credentials, her right to practice the validity of her documentation. Agnes answered each challenge in the level-specific language of someone who had anticipated every question and had prepared an answer that was accurate and complete and did not contain a single unnecessary word. She opened the ledger. She read from it. She read the date and the time of Clara's first visit, and she read her clinical observations in the precise language she had used when she wrote them. 3 ribs in the process of knitting from a break estimated at 4 to 5 weeks prior. evidence of repeated contusion on the upper arms, consistent with gripping force applied by a larger hand, indicators of chronic physiological stress response, including shallow breathing patterns and involuntary muscular bracing. She read the entry from the second visit and the third. Alcott stood for cross-examination. Dr. Foote, you cannot state with certainty who caused these injuries.
I did, thank you.
I can state with certainty that they are consistent with the account given to me by my patient, Agnes said. Consistent is not proof. No, it is evidence. Those are different things, and both of them matter. Cross looked at Alcott. Alcott moved on. Chet came to the stand next. He came slowly with the dignity of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was not going to be hurried about saying it. He took the oath with a seriousness that was not performance. He took his notebook from his coat pocket and set it on the rail in front of him. He read from it. He read 21 entries in his careful, plain handwriting, dates and times and what he had observed, nothing more, nothing interpreted, just the factual record of an observant man over 4 months. The kitchen window at 4 in the morning and a woman moving with the careful economy of someone protecting an injury. The supper table and a husband's comment, and the way the woman at the stove did not respond because she had learned not to. The morning after a night when something had changed in the way she carried herself. He read it all in the same flat, unhurried voice, and when he was done, he closed the notebook and set it on the railing again and waited. Alcott stood. Mr. Darrow, you are an employee of Holt Granger who has a personal interest in this case. I'm an employee of the ranch, Chet said. I kept this notebook before Granger knew I was keeping it, and without his asking me to. You expect this court to believe you simply decided to document your employer's cook's movements for 4 months out of personal initiative. I expect this court to read what I wrote and decide whether it looks like the record of a man making things up. He met Alcott's eyes. I've been writing things down for 22 years. Ask anyone in this county. Alcott moved on. Ray Kinch sat in the third row and watched, and Clara could see the particular stillness of a man reconsidering something he thought he had already decided. Greer called Kit Pruitt. The room shifted. Not loudly, just the collective, subtle movement of people adjusting to an unexpected development. At the defendant's table, Vernon went very still. Kit came to the front of the room with the look of a man who had gotten cold feet 20 times in the last 6 weeks and had gotten back up 20 times and was here now, which meant the 21st time had held. He was pale. His hands, when he was sworn in, were not steady. He sat down. He looked at the judge, not at Vernon, not at Clara, just at the judge. Greer said, Mr. Pruitt, you are the defendant's brother. Yes. And you spent 3 weeks at Granger Ranch in December at the defendant's invitation. Yes. During that time, what did you observe regarding the relationship between your brother and his wife? Kit was quiet for a moment. Clara watched his hands on the railing. He was pressing them flat, the way she pressed her hands flat on difficult mornings for the same reason. I observed, Kit said, and his voice came out steadier than his hands, that my brother talked about his wife the same way you'd talk about something you owned that wasn't working right. He stopped. And that she moved like someone who had learned to take up less space than she needed. I've seen animals move like that, after a while in bad conditions. Alcott was on his feet. Objection. This is interpretation, not observation. Cross. He's testifying to what he saw. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Pruitt. Kit continued. He told the court about the supper table comment, about the way Vernon's voice changed register between public rooms and private ones. He told about standing outside in December without his coat because something was bothering him enough that he forgot the temperature. He told about Clara saying to him, "Watch how he talks about me in the room, and then watch how he talks about me when he thinks you can't hear, and notice if those two things are different." And were they? Greer asked. Very, Kit said. He looked at Vernon for the first time then. Vernon was looking at him with an expression that had moved past the controlled reasonableness and into something older, something that recognized betrayal and had not yet decided what to do with it. Kit looked back at his hands. Alcott's cross-examination was aggressive, and Kit withstood it with the particular stubbornness of someone who has already survived the hardest part, which was deciding to be here. He stumbled on some questions and corrected himself, and he was not a polished witness, but he was an honest one, and the courtroom felt the difference. Then Delia came to the stand. She had arrived in Delaware the previous evening on the stage from Miles City, and Clara had not met her until this morning in the hallway outside the courtroom, and they had looked at each other for a moment with the recognition of two people who have read the same difficult book by different means. Delia was 31 years old and had a healed asymmetry to the way she held her right arm that would be visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She took the oath. She sat down. She looked at Frederick Alcott before he could stand, and she said in a voice that carried to the back of the room, "I'll tell you what you're going to try. You're going to say I have a grudge. You're going to say I'm here because I'm bitter about a marriage that ended badly and I want revenge. And then I'm going to answer your questions, and you can let these people decide whether what I say sounds like a grudge or whether it sounds like a woman telling the truth about something that happened to her body." Cross looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a smile. Alcott stood. "Mrs." He checked his notes. "Mrs. Halverson, you filed a complaint against the defendant in 1882. "I did." "That complaint was withdrawn." "That complaint disappeared from the courthouse before it reached a judge. There's a difference between withdrawn and disappeared." "You cannot prove it disappeared." "I can prove I filed it. I can prove it never reached a hearing. You're welcome to explain the gap." She paused. "I'll wait." Alcott changed direction. He asked about the nature of her complaint. She told him. She used the same plain specific language that Agnes Foote used in her ledger and that Chet used in his notebook, the language of people who had decided that accuracy was more important than comfort. She told about the right arm, about the morning it happened and the specific cause of it and the specific words that were said before and after. About the month she spent finding a way to leave and the filing of the complaint and the weeks of waiting and the eventual word from the courthouse that the documents could not be located. She paused then, not for effect, because the next part was what she had thought about longest in the 3 years since she left in the quiet nights in Idaho, when she thought about the woman Vernon Pruitt would eventually marry next. She said, "Before I filed the complaint, before I even told him I was thinking about leaving, he said something to me." She looked at the judge, not at Alcott. "He said you can try whatever you want. My father has a friend on the county bench, and that friend has never ruled against a Pruitt and never will. He said it the way he said most things, like he was telling me the weather." The courtroom was very quiet. "He knew," Delia said. "He knew before I did anything that there would be no consequences. He had been told there would be no consequences. That is not a man who lost his temper and went too far. That is a man who planned." Vernon's lawyer was on his feet immediately, but the words were already in the room, and they stayed there, settled into the silence the way a stone settles into still water. She told about leaving, about Idaho, about the new husband who she had told everything and who had driven her to the stage himself because he said a man who beats women ought to face what that means. Alcott tried twice more to shake her, and she did not shake. She was not shaking material. She had come a long way at considerable personal cost to say something true in front of people who needed to hear it, and she intended to say it completely. When she stepped down, Clara looked at her and Delia looked back, and something passed between them that was not gratitude, because gratitude implied a debt, and there was no debt here. Only two women on either side of the same experience. One of them further along the road and reaching back to mark the path. Clara took the stand last. She had practiced with Greer. She knew the questions she would be asked, and she knew the ones Alcott would ask, and she had prepared her answers with the same care she applied to every complex task. Attention to detail, attention to sequence, attention to the specific language that was accurate and could not be misread. But sitting in the chair with the courtroom full of people who had known her for varying lengths of time and had various versions of her story in their heads, she understood that what was required of her here was not performance of a prepared answer. What was required was the thing she had been doing for 18 months alone in the dark of a cabin in Montana Territory, telling the truth to herself. Greer took her through the marriage. The beginning of it, which had been fast and not well considered, and which she did not apologize for, because you did not apologize for being 22 years old and believing someone who said they loved you. The change of it, which had not been sudden, which had been gradual in the way of all the worst things, incremental, each step small enough to almost be explained until you looked up and you were so far from where you had started that you could not see the beginning anymore. She told about the ribs. She told about the morning in the kitchen when Holt Granger had asked if she was all right, and she had said fine, and he had known she was not fine, and had said so, and that was the first time in 8 months that anyone had said so. She told it plainly, without reaching for sympathy, in the same tone Agnes Foote used for clinical observation. Alcott stood. He was good at his work. She had expected him to be. He went at the Miles City boarding house first, describing it in terms that were technically accurate and contextually misleading, and she let him finish the description, and then she said, "That boarding house had 18 rooms and served 3 meals a day, and I was hired as the cook. I cooked. That is what happened there." He went at her size next, not directly obliquely suggesting that a woman of her physical presence was perhaps not as vulnerable as she claimed was, perhaps not as easy to harm as she would have the court believe. She looked at him. She said, "Large things can be hurt. That is not a controversial observation." A sound moved through the courtroom. Not laughter, something quieter, the sound of a room recognizing something true. He tried the Holt Granger angle, the suggestion that this was a manufactured grievance designed to free her for another relationship. She said, "Holt Granger noticed I was injured and told me so, and offered me a safe place to sleep. He did this because he employs me and because he is a decent person. I will not insult him by pretending that decency requires an ulterior motive." Alcott looked at his notes. He tried 2 more questions, and she answered them, and he sat down. Cross made notes. He looked at them for a long time. The courtroom was very quiet. He said, "I'm going to take a recess. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. The morning ended. Clara sat in the hallway with May on one side and Delia on the other and Greer across from her, explaining what the recess likely meant and what to expect in the afternoon, and she listened and heard perhaps half of what he said, because the other half of her attention was occupied with the simple fact of sitting in a hallway in a courthouse in Montana Territory in February of 1886 and being for this moment entirely herself. Not Vernon's wife, not the ranch cook, not the large woman who should not look in mirrors, just Clara Pruitt, who had learned to count footsteps and had decided to stop counting them and was here to say so in front of anyone who wanted to listen. Holt came and sat beside her at one point during the recess. He did not say anything for a while. He sat in the way he sat in the kitchen, occupying his space completely without excess. Then he said quietly, "You did well in there. It's not done yet." "No, but you did well." She looked at him. This man who built walls and knew it, and was sitting next to her in a courthouse hallway because he had decided some months ago that there was a difference between not knowing how to let someone in and not wanting to. She said, "Whatever happens this afternoon." He said, "It won't change anything at this end." She nodded. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Judge Abram Cross reconvened at 2 o'clock, and the courtroom was fuller than it had been in the morning, because word travels in small places, and by noon, all of Delaware knew that the morning had not gone the way Frederick Alcott had expected it to go. Vernon sat at his table with the controlled composure of a man who was still calculating, who had not yet stopped believing that there was a play he had not made, an angle he had not seen. Clara looked at him once when she came back to her table, and she saw the calculation, and she thought about 18 months of being on the wrong side of that calculation, and she turned away and sat down and put her hands flat on the table. Cross looked at the courtroom over his papers. He said, "I've been on this bench for 19 years. I've heard a great many cases in that time, and I've formed views about what evidence looks like when it's real and what it looks like when it's been constructed for a purpose." He paused. "This court has heard today from a physician whose documentation is thorough and consistent, from a long-serving employee whose personal record of observation spans 4 months and contains no interpretation, only fact, from the defendant's own brother who testified at what I imagine was considerable personal cost, and from a woman who traveled from Idaho to tell this court something she did not have to tell it." He looked at his papers again. "I've also heard from the plaintiff herself, whose testimony was consistent in detail and tone with every document and every supporting account provided. And I've heard from the defendant, whose account of events was smooth and internally consistent in the way that carefully prepared accounts sometimes are." Cross set down his papers. "The petition for dissolution of marriage is granted," he said. on grounds of cruelty sustained by medical evidence corroborating testimony and prior pattern of behavior as established by the testimony of Delia Halverson. The marriage between Clara Pruitt and Vernon Pruitt is hereby dissolved. He said several more things about terms and conditions and the legal particulars of the dissolution, and Clara heard them at a remove through the sound that moved through the courtroom, which was not loud, but was the sound of a large collective breath being released, and through the sound of Frederick Alcott beginning a procedural objection that Cross shut down in 2 sentences, and through the sound of Vernon Pruitt pushing back his chair. Vernon stood. He looked at the judge. He looked at Alcott. He looked at the back of Clara's head because she had turned away from him and was looking at Samuel Greer, who was gathering his papers with the careful satisfaction of a man who had done his job well. Vernon did not say anything. This was perhaps the most frightening thing he had done in their acquaintance, this final silence, because it meant he had not given up, only recalculated, only moved the problem to a different column in his internal ledger. Clara knew this. She had always known that winning a legal case was not the same as being safe. But she had also known something else for a few months now, which was that she was not doing this alone. And that changed the arithmetic in ways Vernon had not accounted for. She stood up from the table. May was at her side immediately, and Delia and Greer putting papers in his case and saying something about next steps and documentation. The room was loud with conversation and movement, and Clara stood in the middle of it and did something she had not done in a courtroom, had not done in months, possibly had not done since before she understood what her marriage was. She stood at her full height, which was 5 feet and 4 inches, and she let herself take up all of it. Outside, the February air was cold, with the particular clean cold of a clear day after weeks of cloud, the kind of cold that had no malice in it, that was simply itself. The sky was pale blue and enormous in the way that Montana sky is enormous, which is to say completely in every direction without any visible limit. Clara stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in. May stood beside her. Delia came out a moment later and stood on her other side. None of them said anything for a while. There was not yet anything that needed to be said. The thing that had happened was still in the process of being real, of converting from the abstract category of hoped-for outcome to the concrete category of actual event, and that conversion took a moment. Martha Ogle from the post office walked by on the street below and looked up and said without stopping, "Good." Just that one word, and then she was gone, and Clara watched her go and felt something move in her chest that was not grief and not joy, but something that lived between them, the feeling of a thing that has cost you considerably finally being completed. Delia touched her arm lightly. "I have a stage to catch tomorrow morning." Clara turned to her. She did not know what to say, and then she understood that there was not a sentence equal to what Delia had done, and she did not try to find one. She said, "Thank you for coming." Delia looked at her with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has been through something and come out the other side with the kind of clarity that only that passage produces. "You would have done it for me," she said, "if the timing had been different." Clara thought about this. She thought about whether it was true. She wanted it to be true. She thought that it was, or that it would be, or that the woman she was becoming was the woman for whom it would be true, and that this was perhaps the most important thing the last year had made her. "Yes," she said, "I would have." Delia nodded once. She went down the steps into the street and turned toward the hotel where she was staying and did not look back, which was not unfriendliness, but simply the posture of someone who has completed a piece of unfinished business and is now returning to the life they built on the other side of it. Holt was waiting near the horses. He had his hat in his hands in the way he held it when he was going to say something he had thought about. Clara went down the steps and across the street and stopped in front of him. He said, "Chet wants to know if you're coming back for supper or if we're on our own." She looked at him. At this man who held his hat in both hands when he was uncertain and had a letter in his desk drawer that he had not hidden from, and who was standing in a February street holding that hat and waiting for her to tell him when she was ready to go home. She said, "Tell Chet I'll be back in an hour. There's stew from this morning. He just has to heat it." Holt's mouth did something that was close to a smile. "He's not going to heat it, right?" Holt said. "I know. That's why I'm coming back in an hour." She walked to the dry goods store because she needed salt, and she had needed it for 3 days and had not gotten to it. She bought the salt and she walked back out into the February street, and she did not minimize herself going through the door, and she did not assess the room before she entered it, and she did not count the distance between herself and the exit. She was back at Granger Ranch in 50 minutes. The stew was warm enough, which was more than she had expected from Chet. She heated it fully and served it, and the men ate and talked about a fence problem in the south quarter and a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg and the question of whether the weather would hold through the weekend. Vernon's chair at the end of the table was empty. No one mentioned it. Not because they didn't notice, but because they understood in the collective, intuitive way of people who work and live in close quarters that some things are better marked by silence than by speech. After supper, Clara washed the dishes alone and dried them and put them on the shelf in the order she kept them, which was her order, the order that made sense to her, and which no one had ever had cause to question because it was her kitchen. Holt came in when she was finishing. He did not pour coffee this time. He stood near the door and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of stew, and the evening cold was pressing against the walls from outside, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said, months ago, about needing to win this on your own terms. I remember saying it. You did," he said. "You won it on your own terms." She dried the last dish and set it on the shelf. "I had help," she said. "You used the help you had. That's different from needing it to stand up." She turned around. He was still near the door, the man she had catalogued from a doorway in the dark all those months ago, who did not know how to say things beautifully and said them truly instead, which she had come to understand was considerably rarer and more valuable. She said, "Eleanor's letter." He went still. "I found it when I was cleaning," she said. "I read it. I shouldn't have, and I did." She met his eyes. She was right about the wall. She was also right that the wall wasn't all of you. She just got tired before you could show her the rest of it. He was very quiet for a moment. "I'm not tired," Clara said. "I want you to know that. I'm not saying it to make an offer or to change anything tonight. I'm saying it because it's true, and I've decided to say true things when I know them." He looked at her with the specific look she had catalogued over months, the one where he was filing something in the private ledger that no one else had access to, except that the look was different now, less careful, less armored, more like the look of a man who is opening a drawer he had decided to keep locked and finding that the thing inside it was still intact. He said, "I'm going to take that as something to think about. That's all I'm offering it as." He nodded. He put his hat on. He went to the door and then stopped, which was the habit she had catalogued before any other, this pause in doorways, this moment of something not yet said. He said, "She was wrong about one thing." Clara waited. "She said I would never let anyone in." He looked at the door frame. "I let you in. I didn't plan to. It just..." He stopped. Tried again. "It just happened different from how I expected things to happen." He went out. The door closed. Clara stood in her kitchen in the warm quiet and let the evening settle around her, and thought about things happening different from how you expected them to, about the specific shape of a year that had taken her from the floor of a cabin at 4 a.m, counting footsteps in the dark, to standing in a courthouse and saying the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. About all the people who had stood alongside her in that year, May with her direct eyes, and her knowledge of doors, Agnes with her ledger, and her level voice, Chet with his notebook, and his 22 years of watching Kit with his cold hands, and his eventual courage, Delia with her healed arm, and her long journey from Idaho. About a large, quiet man who moved through rooms like weather and held his hat when he was uncertain and did not know how to say things beautifully and said them truly instead. She turned off the lamp over the stove. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, not because she needed to, but because she could, because there was no one counting her seconds, no one whose mood depended on the speed of her movements. She stood in the dark, and she breathed slowly all the way in, all the way out, and her ribs did not catch, and there was no sound she needed to suppress. Then she lit the small lamp near the door, and she went to her room, which was hers, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she looked at the window that showed her the dark Montana sky with its enormous, indifferent stars, and she thought about the morning, not with dread, not with the careful strategic planning of someone mapping routes to the exit, She thought about the morning the way a person thinks about a morning when the morning belongs to them. What she would make for breakfast, whether the flour needed replenishing, whether the cold had peaked, or whether there was more of it coming down off the mountain. She thought about the stove which was hers to light. She thought about the kitchen which was hers to work in. She thought about a hat held in two large hands in a doorway, and a sentence that had not quite finished itself and did not need to tonight, because there was time now. There was more time than she had known what to do with in a very long time, and she intended to use it carefully and well. She lay down. She did not count footsteps. She did not calculate the distance to the door. She closed her eyes. She slept. 6 months later, in the particular golden warmth of a Montana August that made the preceding winter feel like a story someone else had lived, Clara Granger stood in the ranch kitchen at 5 in the morning and made biscuits from the dough she had started the night before. The name was new, 3 months new. They had stood in front of Judge Cross in Deller on a Saturday morning in May, with May and Chet and Kit and Agnes Foote and a handful of the ranch hands as witnesses, and Cross had performed the ceremony with the efficiency of a man who had done it many times, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who felt this particular instance was a reasonable use of the court's time. Holt had said his vows in the flat, honest voice he said everything in, and had held her hand in both of his, which were large enough to hold it completely, which she had thought about later and thought about again, now the particular feeling of being held completely and knowing the hands that held you and trusting them. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The biscuit dough was the same recipe. The stove was the same iron range she had been feeding coal into since the first morning she arrived at this ranch, with a husband who counted her breaths and a body that was already learning the particular disciplines of concealment. Everything was the same, and nothing was the same, and this was, she had come to understand, the most honest description of what it meant to survive something and come through it into a life that was genuinely yours. The biscuits went into the oven. She heard boots on the porch step. Not Vernon's boots. Not the boots of anyone whose approach required measurement and analysis and the preparation of a face. Just boots on a step, heavy and familiar, and then the door opening, and the cool August morning coming in briefly before the warmth of the kitchen reclaimed the room. Holt came in. He looked at the stove. He looked at the coffee pot. He poured himself a cup and stood near the window, which was the way he always started his mornings, looking out at the land that was his, and now also in some essential way hers, 12,000 acres of Montana, that did not care about anyone's history, but had room in it for whatever you intended to build. He said without turning around, "Chet's knee is bad again. He shouldn't be on the north fence today. Tell him that. I'm telling you. You can tell him. He listens to you." "He listens to no one," Clara said. "He just sometimes arrives at the same conclusion by his own route." Holt made a sound that was his version of a laugh. She had learned its registers over the past year, the sounds he made in place of the things other people said aloud, and she had come to find them as legible as speech, more legible sometimes because they were not shaped for anyone's benefit, they were simply what they were. He turned from the window. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was satisfied with directly, without embellishment. "You sleep all right?" he asked. She thought about the last time someone had asked her that question and what it had meant then. She thought about what it meant now, which was simply what the words said, no subtext, no accounting, no check on whether the previous night's ledger was closed. "I did," she said. "You, well enough." The biscuits were nearly done. She could smell them from across the kitchen, that particular warm, yeasty smell that she had once associated only with the obligation of mornings and now associated with something more complicated and more honest, with the choice to be here, with the specific satisfaction of doing something well in a place that was yours. May's voice came from outside, calling to George about something, and then the sound of the bunkhouse door and the first of the hands coming out toward the barn, and the ranch was waking up around them the way it always did, steady and purposeful and not particularly interested in anyone's inner life, just in the work that needed doing and the day that needed getting through. Clara pulled the biscuits from the oven. She set them on the rack to cool for the 2 minutes they needed. No more, she had never understood people who let biscuits sit too long and go tough when patience was so easy to calibrate. Holt came to stand near the counter while she worked, not in the way Vernon had stood near her, not in the way of a man monitoring something he owned, but in the way of a person who wants to be near someone they are glad to be near, which is a different posture entirely, and requires no description beyond the simple fact of it. She handed him a biscuit. He took it. He ate it standing at the counter while she began cracking the first of the eggs, and outside the morning came fully into itself, the light going from gray to gold over the peaks, the horses beginning their morning sounds in the barn. Jet's voice, and then George's voice, and then young Danny Webb, who had hired on in June, and reminded Clara of Kit in his first weeks, that quality of not yet knowing exactly who he was. Kit wrote letters now. He was in Harlan working the livery, and he wrote to Clara occasionally with the careful handwriting of someone who had not written many letters, and was not sure of the form, but was trying. The letters were short and factual, and at the end of each one he wrote without comment or elaboration, "I think I did the right thing in the courtroom." She wrote back each time, "Yes, you did." She cracked the last egg. She set the bowl aside. She looked at the kitchen, her stove, and her shelves, and her window that showed her the morning in all its ordinary gold, and she thought about a woman who had stood in this room 8 months ago and counted her own heartbeats and measured the distance to the door. She thought about what it had taken to get from there to here, the specific cost of it in fear and pain, and the long, patient work of building something piece by piece out of materials that kept being harder to find than you hoped. Agnes and her ledger, Chet and his notebook, May and her directness, Delia and her long journey back to a place she had survived and left and come back to anyway because someone needed her to. All of those things had been necessary, every piece of it. And Holt standing at her counter eating a biscuit in the early morning light, who had noticed the way she held a ladle on a morning when her ribs were broken and had not asked about it and had not looked away and had still been here months later and months after that. Not because she needed saving, but because he had decided in the quiet way, he decided things that this was where he wanted to be. "Good biscuit," he said. "I know," she said. He made the sound that was his laugh again. She heard it without looking up from the eggs, and she felt it somewhere in the center of her chest. That sound felt it the way you feel something warm and real and permanent, the way you feel something that is not going to be taken from you. She started the eggs. The morning went on.